Even after spending hours and hours in its main story, Red Dead Redemption 2 continues to impress, with dozens of characters with interesting stories to tell, and with them, lots of historical references. So let's take a look at the real history of Red Dead Redemption 2. Thanks to Opera GX for sponsoring this video. Opera GX really is the ideal web browser for gamers, letting you customize your setup as your heart desires. My favorite feature has to be GX Mods, which presents the highest level of customization. Listen to background music while you browse, choose custom keyboard sounds or sound effects when opening and closing tabs, and change the themes, colors, and wallpaper of your browser as you please. There are so many mods to choose from in the GX store, with individual modifications that can be customized from the menu available on the sidebar. Another fantastic feature is the GX Corner, where you can find the best deals and free games, and my favorite part, stay up to date with the latest releases and gaming news. For a smooth, fully customizable browsing experience, there really is no better browser for gamers. Download Opera GX using the link in the description.
This is Jim Boy Calloway. The Jim Boy Calloway.
Who?
The gunslinger. Fastest left-handed draw that ever drew breath.
A possible inspiration behind Jim Boy Calloway is John Wesley Hardin, an outlaw and gunslinger who lived in the latter half of the 19th century. Like Calloway, he is thought to have been left-handed, which is rare at the time, or at least rarely recorded. Hardin claimed to have killed more than 36 men, though evidence suggests that some of these may be exaggerated or fabricated. Similarly, Calloway claims to have killed over a dozen people, but as the other gunslingers in this mission suggest, this may not have been the case. Interestingly, one of Hardin's signature weapons was a Smith & Wesson Model 3, which seems to have been recreated in the game as the Schofield revolver, Calloway's weapon of choice. In this mission, Calloway's biography is written by Theodore Levin, whereas in real life, Hardin famously wrote his own autobiography, though in both cases they appear to have the same effect of exaggerating the outlaw's reputation.
What really happened at Sylvia's Saloon back in '76?
Just a lot of bunk, Plato. It's just a lot of bunk.
The word bunk, referring to nonsense, is thought to date back to February 1820, when a speech by North Carolina Congressman Felix Walker was met with disapproval by his colleagues. Walker refused to cut his speech short, claiming that he was making a speech for Buncombe, referring to Buncombe County in North Carolina. An alternate spelling subsequently became slang for nonsense in the US by around 1841, and was shortened to bunk by at least 1900, around the same time as Calloway's usage, though it was perhaps made more famous a little while later by Henry Ford, who in 1916 claimed history is more or less bunk. Throughout this mission, Calloway consistently refers to his biographer as Plato, who was of course an ancient Greek philosopher, one of the central figures of philosophy in fact, often considered one of its originators.
Oh, get photos!
The camera given to Arthur bears a striking resemblance to the original Kodak camera, created by George Eastman around 1888, as well as a subsequent Brownie, created by Frank A. Brownell for the Eastman Kodak Company around 1900, so both fairly appropriate for the time period. In this mission, Arthur is initially tasked with finding and talking to 4 famous gunslingers, each of whom have a varying degree of similarity with real-life outlaws. For example, Emmett Granger, an outlaw who received a federal pardon about 4 years before the events of the game, has a similar name to Emmett Dalton, an outlaw and member of the Dalton Gang who was pardoned after serving 14 years in prison. There's also Flaco Hernandez, a wanted Mexican outlaw associated with the Del Lobo gang who fled to a lodge near the snowy Cairn Lake. Similarly, in real life, there was Red Lopez, a wanted Mexican outlaw who, according to some, ran a gang with former members of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch and fled on foot across snowy mountains to a ranch near Utah Lake. The nickname given to Hernandez, the Terror of the Grizzlies, is similar to those given to several other Mexican bandits around this time, like Manuel Lozada, the Tiger of Alica, or Joaquin Murrieta, the Robin Hood of the West, Procopio, the Red-Handed Babito, and Heraclio Bernal, the Thunderbolt of Sinaloa. Another gunslinger to track down is Billy Midnight, a man who was relatively unknown until he killed his boss, the famous gunslinger Rabbit Matthews. This sounds very similar to the story of Robert Ford, the outlaw who became famous for killing the legendary Jesse James, with whom he worked as a junior member of his gang. Billy Midnight is said to have become an overnight sensation, a national celebrity, giving speaking tours and reenactments all across the country. Robert Ford similarly became a national celebrity, posing for photographs and reenacting the murder in a stage show that toured across the country. Midnight received several death threats and murder attempts, but is ultimately killed by Arthur after running from a bar. Ford similarly survived attempts on his life for several years, until he didn't, eventually killed in his own saloon in 1892.
Hey!
I didn't shoot him in his sleep. If I did, it was the only way.
Like Billy Midnight, Robert Ford also denied cowardice at the death of Jesse James. And just as Midnight became known as the man who killed Rabbit Matthews, Ford became known as the man who killed Jesse James. Arguably the most impressive of the gunslingers is Black Belle, the grand dame of the gunslingers, said to have married 6 times and never divorced. She's likely based on Belle Starr, the bandit queen, said to have married at least 3 times, possibly with as many as 8 lovers, but never divorced. Black Belle's choice of clothing colour is suggested by her name, and Belle Starr was similarly said to have dressed in black velvet, with a plumed hat, 2 pistols, and belts of cartridges across her hips.
I'm an old man. This never happened to Achilles, nor Gawain, nor Caesar.
Calloway is, of course, referring to 3 legends of history: Achilles, the hero of the Trojan War, the greatest of the Greek warriors; Gawain, a knight in Arthurian legend and King Arthur's closest companion; and Julius Caesar, the Roman general and dictator who saw the initial transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire.
Well, I always hated Slim Grant.
Well, where's Slim Grant? Who's Slim Grant?
He's state marshal now, out of Annesburg.
Insofar as a lawman also being known as a gunslinger, Slim Grant may be based on Wyatt Earp. Best known for his role in the gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881, Wyatt Earp was associated with the law for much of his life, becoming assistant marshal, deputy marshal, and full marshal of towns and cities at several points in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. After completing this mission, Arthur receives $350 for his services, the equivalent of almost $13,000 today, and a letter from Levin telling him that the book is selling like hotcakes. This phrase, meaning for something to be in great demand, seems to originate around 1839. There's nothing in particular that apparently led to its origin, but hotcakes were always popular at church events and fairs, so it's an apt idiom. As for a book about famous gunslingers selling well, this is entirely unsurprising. Dime novels were especially popular around the 1840s to 1890s and beyond, often for representing real people in America and for telling fictionalized stories about famous real people, including gunslingers and outlaws like Jesse James, Wyatt Earp, and Billy the Kid. Audiences enjoyed reading about the heroes and villains of the Old West, even before that time had passed. Speaking of wannabe heroes, in Valentine, Arthur encounters 2 brothers, Protus and Acrisius, fighting to gain the love and attention of Helen. Interestingly, Protus and Acrisius are also the names of twin brothers in Greek mythology, who were said to have quarrelled even in the womb. Their quarrel continued into when Acrisius was the king of Argos. Eventually, they decided to split and share their kingdom, with Protus ruling Tiryns. Based on this then, it's logical that Helen is based on Helen of Troy, said to have been the most beautiful woman in the world and whose abduction essentially started the Trojan War. Interestingly, her surrogate father, Tyndareus, was actually a descendant of Acrisius, his great-great-grandson.
You can tell he's not human because of his beady red eyes and his bestial tail.
Interestingly enough, the coccyx or tailbone is considered the remnant of a lost tail. All mammals have a tail at some point in development, and incredibly rarely, a short tail-like structure is present at birth. So rare in fact that there were only 23 recorded cases of humans born with this between 1884 and 1988.
I look like that milksop there, but 'tis no matter.
The word milksop, literally referring to a piece of bread soaked in milk, and figuratively to a man devoid of manliness, originates around the 13th to 15th centuries.
Shoot a bottle off my head, like William Tell.
William Tell is a folk hero of Switzerland, an expert crossbow marksman, first referenced in the White Book of Saanen in the late 15th century. According to legend, in November 1307, he shot an apple off of his son's head, forced to do so as punishment for not paying respect to his superior.
He would have been better off staying at prep school.
In the US, these refer to preparatory schools, basically high school but focused on preparing for university, essentially as a feeder school for university. Some of the earliest include Phillips Academy in Massachusetts and Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire, both often considered feeder schools for Harvard University.
Or going to the seminary.
Interestingly, Phillips Academy also housed the Andover Theological Seminary, one of the oldest theological seminaries in the United States.
Punch us both as hard as you can. You'll break his glass jaw.
As the name suggests, a glass jaw refers to a weak jaw, one lacking the ability to absorb much force. One of the first written instances was in 1904, but as it was presented without further explanation or clarification, this likely means it was a familiar term around this time, so a logical inclusion here.
I got a proper chin! Not like that toe rag.
Unsurprisingly, this often referred to rags, strips of cloth, that people, often convicts, would wear on their toes, often in lieu of socks. It was first recorded in 1864 in this context. It soon became known as a term of abuse, particularly in the UK, first in 1875. Interestingly, it's often written as toe rag with a W, which is regularly seen as incorrect. However, the original printing of the phrase in 1856 was spelled this way, though since it was in quotes, perhaps it was acknowledged as incorrect then too.
He's a troll. That's why we found him here. He escaped from his bridge.
Trolls are part of Nordic folklore and Norse mythology, dating to at least a Prose Edda book written around the 13th century. Trolls being found under bridges are thought to date to the story Three Billy Goats Gruff, a Norwegian fairy tale published in the 1840s, wherein a troll attempts to outsmart three male goats in order to stop them from crossing a bridge. Based on the publication history then, it's a logical reference. Elsewhere in the world, Arthur encounters three mutilated bodies, each accompanied by a note from the killer taunting him. One such note simply asks the question, "Do you see?" This is a fairly generic phrase, but considering its context, it might be inspired by Thomas Harris's novel Red Dragon. Not so much historically, since it was published about 80 years after the game takes place, but perhaps as a reference. In the novel, a serial killer taunts a journalist by showing him several disturbing slides while repeating the question, "Do you see?" A scene that became known in the film adaptations Manhunter and Red Dragon. Accompanying one of the other bodies is the taunt, "Look on my works." Both historically and referentially, this may be based on Percy Shelley's 1819 sonnet Ozymandias. "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." The poem is considered a lesson to tyrants about their inevitable decline, perhaps fairly relevant to the killer in this context then. Speaking of which, the killer is revealed to be a man named Edmund Lowry Jr. He could really be based on any number or combination of real and fictional serial killers. In fact, there were several around this time, in the decades before and after, with whom Lowry shares some similarities, like Stephen D. Richards, who is considered polite and well-dressed, Jack the Ripper, who sent letters boasting about his crimes, H.H. Holmes, who wanted people to know about his crimes to the point where he seemingly exaggerated and fabricated several, and whose real name, Herman, resembles one of Lowry's victims, Albert Fish, who tortured and mutilated his victims, and Ed Gein, real name Edward, like one of Lowry's victims, who kept mutilated body parts in his shed, like Lowry does in a basement, and whose violence was directed towards women who physically resembled his mother, just as Lowry appears to have similar issues with his mother. In the letter from Lowry's mother, she recommends that he takes the laudanum given to him by a doctor to improve his nerves. Laudanum is a tincture of opium that was widely used in the 19th century as a sleeping aid and painkiller. It is highly addictive, however, and often leads to drug addictions. In a brief interaction in Saint Denis, Arthur encounters a woman asking for donations.
"We're trying to raise money to build an expansion to the Quincy Harris Memorial Hall, a shelter for homeless veterans and their families."
After the Civil War ended in the mid-1860s, the United States underwent several recessions and a general deflation lasting until the 1890s. In this time, many people, including hundreds of thousands of soldiers and their families, were displaced and many were homeless. Several groups claim to assist veterans around this time, like the National Asylum for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers, established in 1865. The Quincy Harris Memorial Hall is also accurate in its naming. In the game, Quincy Harris is a Confederate general, and there are several memorial sites for and named after Confederate generals in real life.
A donation of $20 would put us well on our way.
The equivalent to over $730 today, so Arthur's reaction is logical.
$20 ain't no chicken feed, but sure, I can help you out. I'm looking for, the mayor?
In another side mission, the mayor of Saint Denis, Henry Lemieux, tasks Arthur with some unsavory tasks. Whether intentional or not, there are other political figures of Louisiana, the real-life equivalent of the state of Lemoyne, with similarly controversial histories. In 1891, 9 of the 19 Italian men indicted in the murder of New Orleans police chief David Hennessy were either acquitted or had their case declared a mistrial, while the other 10 awaited trial. Unhappy with the result, a mob broke into the jail and killed 11 of the 19 men. One prominent member of the mob was Walter C. Flower, who 5 years later was elected mayor of New Orleans, the real-life version of Saint Denis. Interestingly, the murder of a police officer in the middle of an investigation into an Italian crime family is also alluded to in a newspaper in the game, which somewhat implies that Angelo Bronte may have been responsible for the death of Officer Henry Jenkins. Notably, however, the mayor is not mentioned. Another controversial real-life politician from Louisiana was Huey Long, who was impeached in 1929 of 8 charges, but the impeachment was later suspended without a trial. Long was governor of Louisiana from 1928 to 1932, and then senator until his assassination in 1935. Many academics and writers negatively view him as a dictator or demagogue, and few others as a populist champion.
This even nastier little man from New Haven has come here to verify my paintings, and he's saying that they're all fake.
Art forgery actually dates back quite some time, to at least the 14th century. By some accounts, the great artist, sculptor, and painter Michelangelo is said to have started with art forgery. His since-lost statue Sleeping Eros, sculpted in 1496, was sold to a collector of Roman antiquities, having been passed off as an ancient statue. Michelangelo's skills, of course, were so evident in his forgery that it actually led to later work, which is not often the case. Interestingly, for a long time, artists and amateur connoisseurs were entrusted in judging the authenticity of art. It was around the late 19th and early 20th centuries when full-time art historians were entrusted with this. They were less focused on artistic or even financial value, and more so on the authenticity through consultation with several historical sources. Experts around this time issued certificates asserting authenticity, and the legitimacy of these certificates often hinged on the specialist's reputation, hence the reluctance of Professor Shiftacre here.
I couldn't! My reputation!
In 50 years, man will put down his guns and start living a life of relentless purity.
Hear, hear!
This term is the shortened version of hear ye, or hear him, first recorded in the 17th century, though the use of the word hear as a command to listen dates back much further. Its reduction to hear occurred by the late 18th century, so much earlier than its usage here. It's often used in the House of Commons in British Parliament, where cheering is frequently discouraged or forbidden. It's also often incorrectly written as H-E-R-E, such as in the game's subtitles here. In the second part of this mission, the mayor tasks Arthur with threatening Hector Fellows.
He's a newspaper man, and
He's leaving town on a coach, heading to his country estate because he doesn't like your heavy-handed approach.
Fellows and the Saint Denis Times wouldn't be the first newspaper to disapprove of a political figure, including in Louisiana, like the Democratic Advocate, established in 1842 to defeat candidates of the Whig political party.
to convince him to make good on his promise to help finance the library.
Interestingly, the New Orleans Public Library publicly opened its doors in 1897, so around this same time. Similarly, the Howard Memorial Library was opened in New Orleans in 1889, some years after the death of its namesake, Charles T. Howard, who had sought to provide several charitable contributions for public improvements, including, shortly before his death, a library, which was completed and named in his honor.
This is an old field guide. Might be of some interest to you, maybe not. But please have it.
The book that Lemieux gives to Arthur is called Farm, Field and Falconry by George T. Duval. Probably coincidentally, there was a farmer named George T. Duval who lived from 1784 to the 1870s. He was considered a trusting and honorable man of high standing, and was one of the earliest settlers of Lewis County, Virginia.
Where do I find him?
Well, he does live over on Rue de Zacharie.
In French, the word rue means street. Interestingly, there was also a Rue Zacharie in Paris, which crossed with the Rue de la Huchette, one of the oldest streets along the Rive Gauche. However, it was renamed Rue Xavier Privas in 1929, some 30 years after Arthur visits a similarly named street here.
The end of labor is to gain leisure. Is that not what Aristotle said?
Aristotle, of course, was an ancient Greek philosopher who lived in the 4th century BC, and Charlotte is right. This quote is often attributed to Aristotle. However, in this exact form, it may not have actually been said by him. The closest quote is from the 10th book of Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle's best-known work on ethics, which states, "Happiness is thought to depend on leisure, for we are busy that we may have leisure, and make war that we may live in peace."
And we were both born with a silver spoon.
This phrase, of course, refers to one being born in affluence, being born into wealth. It's thought to allude to the tradition of gifting a spoon to a child at its christening, as Shakespeare and Fletcher wrote about in the 1600s, and perhaps to the fact that it was fashionable for people to carry their own spoons with them, though on its simplest level it may simply refer to wealthy people eating from silver, while others do not. The earliest instance of the idiom in literature is in 1762. One man is born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and another with a wooden ladle. If Arthur explores Charlotte's house, he can find several different products, like the Lily of the Valley face wash and skin whitener. There are several examples of face washes and skin whiteners around this time, and interestingly enough, Lily of the Valley was the name of a perfume bottle popular around this time. There's also a bottle of Florida water, which is essentially American cologne. Regarded a unisex cologne, it was apparently created by Robert Murray in New York City in 1808. Near these bottles, though a little obscured, is a jar of kettle-rendered lard. While not as significant as butter or tallow, lard and vegetable oils were somewhat important edible fats in the 19th century. One popular method of rendering lard, generally for a higher grade product, was on a steam-jacketed kettle, as is the case with this product in the game. Hidden away in a box on the floor are several bottles of Schiffer beer, created by the Amos Schiffer Brewing Company of Chicago. These can also be found elsewhere in the game, bought at saloons for 50 cents. This beer could be based on any number or combination of companies, but its name and logo are reminiscent of two in particular. The F&M Schaefer Brewing Company, founded in New York in 1842 by Frederick and Maximilian Schaefer, and known for its Schaefer beer, and the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company, founded in Milwaukee in 1849 and taken over and renamed in 1858 by Joseph Schlitz, known for its Schlitz beer. Schlitz became the largest beer producer in the US in 1902, and had this title several times throughout the 20th century. While the companies themselves have undergone several changes and acquisitions in their more than 170 years, the actual beers, at least in some form, continue to be produced today. Whether it's gunslingers, serial killers, or political figures, Red Dead Redemption 2's ability to make historical references never fails to impress. And we're still not done. There are still many interesting, quirky, and perhaps dark characters to meet, and more history to discover in the process.